Hello, my name is Paul Douglas, and I'd like to welcome you to episode number 3 of A Letter to an Apostle.
I know, President Uchtdorf, that the church is in a quandary as to what they can do to stop this hemorrhaging, to stop the defections. What to do when so many are publicly questioning the church's narrative. So far, the church has stayed with its time-honored, counterproductive practice of excommunicating anyone who too publicly questions their dogma, a policy that is counterproductive as they're losing their best and their brightest. Until recently, it was not that easy to discover the troubling aspects of the church's historicity and the Joseph Smith story. The internet has changed all that. I've heard it said that the internet is to Mormonism what the King James Bible was to Catholicism. Some have suggested that the ship has hit an iceberg and is going down, the ship being the church and the iceberg being the internet. I think this is going too far. There is no doubt that the internet has impacted on Mormon retention rates as people encounter troubling historical facts that undermine their testimony. I am, however, somewhat skeptical if it is the primary reason for the church's losses. I'm not denying that the internet has not had a major effect. I'm more disputing whether it is the direct mechanism of that effect. As we discovered in our last episode, the law of conformity suggests that people tend to adopt the behaviors and beliefs of others in large measure. The internet allows people to expand their community and encounter new peers unrestricted by geography. As individuals enter these new virtual social groups, changes in belief and behavior take place, often leading people to reduce their affiliation with prior social groups or peers. Regardless, I think the church was woefully unaware of how impactful the internet and the societal changes it brought would be, and typical of large bureaucracies, it was slow to respond to these changes. It's not that the church came to the table too late. In January 1997, in fact, the church launched its first official web page, less than a year after Google launched in September of 1998. However, because of the church's rigid inflexibility and strict compliance to rules and regulations, discouraging initiative and creativity, it exhibited a sluggish reaction. It was slow at recognizing and moving to counter the accurate and inaccurate historical information it contained, and it demonstrated a tepid response to the crisis it portended. During a question and answer at Utah State University in 2011, Elder Marlon K. Jensen, who was then the church historian, fielded a question from a woman in the audience. She asked when the church's manuals would start to reflect what she had learned about the church through her own research on the internet. She then asked Jensen whether he was aware that many Mormons were leaving the church because of what they'd learned about church history on the internet. "We are aware," Jensen said, sounding somewhat defeated. "We have another initiative we've called Answers to Gospel Questions. We're trying to figure out exactly what channel to deliver it in and exactly what format to put it in. But we want to have a place where people can go. We've hired someone that's in charge of search engine optimization." So in 2011, the church was still unsure of the direction it should take. The church began releasing the Gospel Topics essays in 2013, but some suggested that it was too little and too late. The church recognizes that the Gospel Topics essays don't always validate beliefs, and it's perhaps for that reason that the church has made them really hard to find on level 4 of the church's website. You almost have to go through Google to get to the part of the website where they reside. I would speculate that most Mormons don't even know that they exist. One might suggest that the real impetus behind their creation was so that when someone goes to their bishop and says, "I read on the internet that Joseph Smith had more than 30 wives, some as young as 14, and he married other men's wives," the bishop can say, "But we've had that on our website. We never hid it from you. It's just not something that we talk about all that much." But even conceding that the Gospel Topics essays were also intended to acknowledge and address some of the troubling historical issues that are causing members to doubt and in many cases to leave the church, they've been criticized for being replete with historical misinterpretations, misleading statements, and most of all, an abundance of omissions. They're so highly edited and correlated, so factually massaged to make them of little or no value of someone seeking the whole story. A great example is the essay on the book of Abraham, which not only fails the Occam's razor test, but stretches credulity to extraordinary lengths. Another good example is their essay on blacks in the priesthood, in which they state, in 1850, the U.S. Congress created Utah Territory, and the U.S. President appointed Brigham Young to the position of territorial governor. Southerners who had converted to the church and migrated to Utah with their slaves raised the question of slavery's legal status in the territory. In two speeches delivered before the Utah Territorial Legislature in January and February of 1852, Brigham Young announced a policy restricting men of black African descent from priesthood ordination. At the same time, President Young said that at some future date, black church members would have all the privileges and more enjoyed by other members. This essay fails, however, to include the many racist statements made by Young, as well as quotes by him that indicate that there is no promise that the restrictions would be lifted in the foreseeable future. What is that mark? You'll see it on the countenance of every African you'll ever see upon the face of the earth or ever will see. Now I tell you what I know. When the mark was put upon Cain, Abel's children were all probably young. The Lord told Cain that he should not receive the blessings of the priesthood, nor his seed, until the last of the posterity of Abel had received their priesthood, until the redemption of the earth. If there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ who spoke it before, I tell you, the people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of old Cain. I know they are. I know they cannot bear rule of the priesthood, for the curse is on them, and will remain upon them until the residue of the posterity of Michael and his wife receive the blessings the seed of Cain would have received had they not been cursed, and hold the keys of the priesthood until the time of the restoration shall come, and the curse be wiped off the earth. Also, there's this statement from April the 3rd, 1852, which appeared in the Deseret News. Yet the Canaanites may believe the gospel, repent and be baptized, and receive the Spirit of the Lord. And if he continues until Abel's race is satisfied with his blessings, then may the race of Cain receive a fullness of the priesthood, and become satisfied with its blessings, and the two of them become as one again, when Cain has paid the utmost farthing. And there's no explanation or defense of the far worse things that Young said about blacks that are heralded on the internet. You see some classes of the human family that are black, uncouth, uncomely, disagreeable, and low in their habits, wild, and seemingly deprived of nearly all the blessings of the intelligence that is bestowed upon humanity. Shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot, and will always be so. And that was from Brigham Young, a speech that he gave in 1863, recorded in the Journal of Discourses. President Uchtdorf, it would seem that the church is in a bit of a bind. If they're honest, they know that members will leave in droves. I suppose that they're hoping that at least the less discerning members will accept the superficial stories the essays tell, and not seek the whole truth. That their search for truth will end there, and they'll not expend the energy to go on and read the work of non-Mormon historians or archaeologists or geneticists who tell a very different story. Are the Gospel Topics essays working? Well, 7 years into the essays project, they seem to have done little to stop the wave of defections. In my opinion, things will not get better for the Mormon Church unless or until it addresses the bureaucratic weaknesses it currently suffers from, the rigid inflexibility and strict compliance to rules and regulations, which discourage useful initiative and creativity from those within the organization who have much to contribute. Presently, it exhibits a sluggish reaction to change and a timid response to crisis. More importantly, the church needs to move in the direction of more transparency and fewer secrets, to practice what it preaches, to tell the truth. The LDS Church is a geneocracy. It's run by old men whose only qualification for the top job is that they simply outlived their peers. Many of them actually fall into a vegetative state during their tenure. Are these the people that you would want to run a vital organization? But how do you get the next apostle in line to do the right thing and bow out, or to change the rules of secession? After all, some of these guys have been waiting in the wings for decades. The church has become more and more centralized and impersonal. It would seem that the rules drawn to achieve corporate objectives have become an end in themselves. Unthinking, perfunctory ways of doing things are stressed. It can be argued that the organizational rules and regulations are given priority over members' needs, desires, or feelings. And perhaps most importantly, there's isolation at the top. It seems to me that as the church grew in complexity, greater rewards were bestowed on those at the top, and they became increasingly out of touch with lower-level participants in the organization and their issues, their fears, and concerns. This has to change if the church wishes to remain viable. I'd mentioned that one issue that may have a deleterious effect is increased bureaucratization, with its attendant inflexibility, irresolute response to change, and impersonality. It is certainly anecdotal, but I've heard people say that the church seems to lack the vitality it once had. It now feels more like an organization and less like a church. Certainly there are other factors affecting the church's growth, including the general increase in secularization in the developed world. It's almost trite to say that the world's newest major religion is no religion. And just as a rising tide lifts all boats, an ebbing tide also lowers them. But in the LDS Church's case, Google and the ubiquitous Internet has had and continues to have a much more significant impact on their church than it has had on other churches, with the possible exception of Scientology. The LDS Church is more vulnerable than most because of its astounding and disprovable claims, the claims made by its founder, and the fact that the genesis of this peculiar religion is quite recent, well within the grasp and examination of scholars and historians. Websites such as Mormon Think, xmormon.org, the CES letter, Jonathan Streeter's Toda's YouTube site, Mormon Stories, Mormonism Live, and now this broadcast are just a click away. In the world of smartphones and the Internet, everyone has their own Urim and Thummim right in the palm of their hand. Members and investigators alike can now access historically accurate, uncorrelated, and unsanitized material on Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church's foundational claims than was possible just a few decades ago. It is indeed becoming harder to keep secrets in this digital age. Apostle Orson Pratt said, "Convince us of our errors of doctrine, if we have any, by reason, by logical argument, or by the word of God, and we will be ever grateful for the information, and you will have the pleasing reflection that you have been instruments in the hands of God for redeeming your fellow beings from the darkness which you may see enveloping their minds." Well, righto, Orson. I've asked many questions in my letter to an apostle that, as Orson indicates, by reason and logic are difficult to reconcile. I'm not asking out of ignorance, and while President Russell Nelson might label me as a lazy learner, I have, at least to the extent of my limited abilities, diligently explored, researched, and investigated many of the concerns and difficulties that are at issue for me. I've tried to uncover the most recent, reliable material related to each interrogatory. I've also tried to be careful to cite my sources. As I've already said, most of the facts I quote, as well as the commentaries I reference, come from church-friendly sources, LDS historical documents, church newspapers and periodicals, as well as the Journal of Discourses, Lectures on Faith, and History of the Church. I've also gone to the letters of learned and some not so learned church leaders, and of course the scriptures themselves. The rest of the facts, data, and information I've garnered come from serious and often meticulous research conducted by leading scholars in several scientific disciplines and, of course, professional historians. You will not find references to the many mean-spirited articles posted on the Internet by those whose obvious purpose is to mock or despoil. When it comes to questions of a purely scientific nature, matters relating to archaeology, anthropology, paleontology, genetics, and so on, admittedly I've given greater credence to the considered opinions of non-Mormon scientists, because these scholars have fewer biases or predispositions that might impede their willingness to go where the truth leads them. An examination of the confirmation bias in the archaeology department at BYU is reflected in the following statement by one of its professors, Dr. Carrie Mulstein, as reported in a recent Deseret News article. And I'm quoting, "I start out with an assumption that the Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon and anything else that we get from the restored gospel is true," he said. "Therefore, any evidence I find, I will try to fit into that paradigm."
It's not hyperbole to say that young people are the future of the church. According to the 2011 Pew Research Center's survey of American Mormons, 51% of American converts are under the age of 25. The church's hard line on LGBTQ issues is alienating to a generation that, as a whole, embraces inclusion and diversity. Homosexuality is not as problematic for millennial Mormons as it was for their parents. President Uchtdorf, I believe the problems about the truth claims of the church that I've outlined below need to be addressed in a more direct, honest, and comprehensive and less defensive way. Also, unless the goal is plausible deniability, I can't understand why the church hides behind and gives tacit support to unofficial apologetic sites. Why can't you and your comrades just answer honestly and directly the legitimate concerns members and non-members have with the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, and the foundational claims of the church?
As for the avowals of the apologists at Fair, while less shrill and unchristlike than the stuff that used to come out of farms, this new generation of apologists now seem to have adopted a tenor of desperate revisionism, failing a Mormon reformation or a significant change to the church's dominant narrative. Any future growth of the Mormon church will in no wise equal its past. But please, I'm not suggesting that the LDS church will soon disappear. I think anyone who thinks it will doesn't know much about history or, for that matter, bureaucracy. And studies such as the 2016 New Mormon Survey, NMS, show that chapel-going Mormons still have a very high level of belief. NMS questioned American Mormons about the level of their belief in Mormonism, its doctrines and practices. They asked members the question, which statement comes closest to your views, even if none is exactly right? The results were, A, I believe wholeheartedly in all of the teachings of the church. That was 49.1%. B, I believe many or most of the teachings of the LDS church. That was 33.9%. C, some of the teachings of the LDS church are hard for me to believe. That was 12.2%. D, many or most of the teachings of the LDS church are hard for me to believe. That was 3.1%. And E, I do not believe in the teachings of the LDS church. That was 1.8%. Over 80% of those asked said they believed in all, many, or most of the teachings of the LDS church. That's a very impressive statistic. Nevertheless, in my opinion, there are a few significant impediments to any significant further growth of the Mormon church.
First, we can't escape the fact that Mormonism is and always has been largely an American religion. People outside the United States and countries that the church needs to fuel its future growth are becoming often turned off by American exceptionalism and what they see as a style over substance, celebrity-worshipping materialistic culture, as well as the prosperity gospel that the brethren have been known to preach to bolster tithing receipts is recognized by many as questionable. Second, the church is out of step with most people in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe when it comes to contemporary social issues. A woman's right to make choices related to her own body, the struggle for fairness and equality in LGBTQ issues, and a host of other less dominant factors, euthanasia, the use of marijuana, etc.
But I believe that the greatest obstacle to any future growth of Mormonism has to be Joseph Smith. Smith's polygamy and polyandry and his ceaseless lying about these and other matters, not just to his associates and followers, but to his legal wife Emma, is unacceptable to most people. As well, his failed prophecies, numerous run-ins with the law, financial shenanigans, and his boastful, self-aggrandizing nature is hard to take. Many members are becoming aware of Smith's marriages and sexual unions with teenage girls, some as young as 14 years of age. This is hard for decent people to accept. This is hard for many Mormons to accept. Likewise, Smith's lengthy rap sheet, including arrests for glass looking, being a disorderly person, threatening a sitting judge, perjury, inciting a riot, bank fraud, and twice for both conspiracy to commit murder and treason. When people discover the real Joseph Smith, warts and all, not the sanitized fiction that the church has crafted, it's not a pretty picture. Also, as many non-Mormon historians now turn their attention to Joseph Smith and his foundational claims, the more difficult it has become for the church to put a positive spin on his actions, behavior, and most of all, his character. Maybe not all things that are true are useful, as your replacement in the first presidency, Dallin Oakes, repeats with a smirk, but they're still true, and useful or not, they'll be revealed despite relentless attempts at censure and cover-up. I suspect many, perhaps most, true-believing members, particularly those over 50, will continue to do as they've been instructed and avoid exposure to anything that's not faith-promoting. To these, Mormonism is something that you do rather than something that you believe. It's going too far to picture most Mormons as latter-day Manchurian candidates, naive souls whose indoctrination has been so efficient that they accept unconditionally everything coming out of the mouths of their leaders. But statements from Oakes and Tanner, such as, "We shouldn't criticize the brethren even when they're wrong," or "Once the prophet speaks, the debate is over," has to give one pause. Surely, President Uchtdorf, as an elderly German, you must ask yourself, do these statements not resonate with a familiar fascistic tenor? We are seeing a growing number of members, particularly young ones, having the courage, despite the cognitive dissonance they experience, to search for truth. Prospects, or investigators as the church calls them, are finding easy access to the rapidly growing number of online resources challenging the church's foundational narrative and truth claims. While some would suggest that the church's leadership's lack of transparency is based on the belief that if its members were to be exposed to the church's real history, they'd leave in droves, a more generous view might grant that the imperative is to protect members, particularly the elderly, from unnecessary pain and confusion. I suspect to a degree that both are true. The problem, however, is that in the 21st century, an increasing number of members will nonetheless be exposed to the unvarnished truth. At that point, they'll not just feel confused, they'll feel deceived. And this is likely to be worse than any difficulty that could arise from the church not being forthright, because it begs the question, what else aren't they telling me? Would it not be better to just rip off the Band-Aid and honestly face the legitimate doubts, concerns, and questions people are having with the church's truth claims? To do what is right, letting the consequences follow, even if it means the reconstruction of the church's dominant narrative. Why not admit that Joseph Smith was anything but a saint, and not brush it off with Joseph wasn't perfect? One last thing, however. Before we get into the meat of my analysis, there is a view within the church that we should not question, but rather accept whatever the church leaders tell us. This view is well illustrated in the following excerpt from an editorial that appeared in the church's news reporting the church conference of April 7th, 1895, in which Wilfred Woodruff stood up and said with annoyance, "Cease troubling yourselves about who God is, who Adam is, who Christ is, who Jehovah is. For heaven's sake, let these things alone." What he was essentially saying was, damn you, just believe what I tell you to believe. I liked Eldon Tanner. He was my branch president way back when I was a young boy. As a minister of the Crown in Alberta, he found my father a job when we emigrated to Canada, but I cannot accept his statement that when the prophet speaks, the debate is over, any more than I, and perhaps you, could accept that when the Führer speaks, the debate is over. I've been asked, why go to the trouble of studying, researching, and writing all this? Why not just keep it to yourself or walk away? Well, it's the old, they can leave the church, but they can't leave it alone. Well, it's complicated, but let me try to answer the question with a parable. A man is diagnosed with a very aggressive form of cancer. After the initial shock of the bad news, he searches for the very best clinic to prolong, maybe even to save his life, a hospital where he can get the very best treatment. After an exhaustive investigation, he settles on a facility that many others have testified to be highly effective, even though it's extremely costly. This hapless soul sells all that he has and travels to this far distant facility. But after a time, as his fortune is depleted and his health deteriorates even further, he learns that the clinic is a fraud. He discovers that the chemotherapy and medications that he's been administered
were nothing more than placebo sugar pills. His radiation treatment, it was revealed, amounted to nothing more than a doctor shining a laser pointer on his body. And he learns that his physicians are members of fringe medical groups, not licensed MDs. What should this poor man do? Pack his bags and quietly walk away? What would you do? I'm guessing that you'd cause a stir. You might go to the press or to the law. You do your best to warn others of this gross deception and fraud. I understand that when someone questions your long-held beliefs, one's first response is likely to be anger. As suggested in Galatians 4:16, have I now become your enemy for telling you the truth?
Like everyone who publicly questions the church's official narrative, I've been the recipient of ad hominem attacks. One can hardly write a critique on something as central as one's core beliefs without this being the case. Rarely have these attacks been, however, to my face. Usually they're anonymous missives or malicious gossip. I understand the genesis of such hostility, and my ego is not so tender that I'm disheartened by it. The only time, I must confess, it hurts when it comes from family or those I considered friends. I hope you will believe me when I tell you that in A Letter to an Apostle, I'm not intending to hurt anyone. It merely tries to provide facts and evidence that many, perhaps most members are unaware of, information that can empower and enable a more informed position regarding the truth claims of the Mormon Church. It's about providing a clearer basis for informed consent. President Uchtdorf, I love the Mormon people. If you see your hated enemy headed for destruction, one might be motivated to just let them go forward. I'm writing this in the hope that it might save those that you and I care about. The Titanic cannot be turned around quickly, but it's not too late to enter the turn. For the Lord knows that I suspect you know that a change in direction is dearly needed. An enormous iceberg looms on the horizon, and that berg is named truth. I think dramatic, new, and open approaches are called for. And from what I've observed, you are among the few at the top that recognize that as well. I don't presume to know what form this should take, but it must start with an openness and honesty. Would that take courage? Yes. Would it make some members aware of issues that they're unaware of at the present? Unquestionably. Would some members leave? Certainly. President Uchtdorf, I suspect you are more than aware of all the issues I present here. As far back as 1908, B.H. Roberts made the top leadership aware of these and other problems with the church's dominant narrative, particularly problems with the Book of Mormon. I guess I'm asking how you can manage to hold a sincere testimony of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the gospel it proclaims in the face of these issues unless you have compelling answers to them beyond the doleful tonics that the church apologists propagate. I'm asking on behalf of the growing number of members hungering and thirsting for the truth. If in fact you have answers, share them. A real spiritual witness is powerful and influential. But if we have serious reasoned objections and fairly and wholly have taken into consideration the available evidence, surely a burning in the bosom cannot negate these legitimate concerns. Proverb 28:26 teaches that he that trusteth in his own heart is a fool, but whoso walketh wisely, he shall be delivered. Unlike the Book of Mormon, the truth of the Bible does not require that we abandon critical thinking and just pray for a good feeling to prove that it's truly the Word of God. Jesus never taught that we must pray to know if His gospel is true. The truthfulness of the Holy Bible is evidenced to anyone willing to investigate it. Unlike the Book of Mormon, the Bible is self-consistent and extraordinarily authentic. Its geography exists. Many of its characters have been verified. Unlike the Book of Mormon, the Bible has been confirmed countless times by archaeology and other sciences. It possesses divine insights into the nature of the universe, and unlike Joseph Smith, its prophets have made correct predictions about future events with great accuracy. As well, there are tens of thousands of manuscripts that we can examine. I don't doubt that you must have strong feelings about the church. However, I would question whether these feelings are enough to suspend all application of reason. People from all faiths report having the same feelings that witness to them that their religion and beliefs are true. Eliza Kim, a young devout Muslim, shares her testimony, and I quote, "After reciting the Shahada, what I felt cannot be accurately described. I felt a rushing sensation go through me, which felt like a thorough cleansing. I felt pure and was given lightness, peace, and genuine happiness. I had never felt such innocent gladness like that in my life. And those feelings have stayed with me till this day, and I know will be with me until my last day in this world. I'm happy with Allah, my Maker, and with my chosen religion. If Moroni's challenge works for Mormons and their faith, certainly the same principle must work for Muslims and theirs, Jews and theirs, Catholics and theirs. Surely you cannot claim that Mormons exclusively have the gifts of the Spirit. I've had the Spirit touch me in a few ways during my life, a few times, but not when I was reading the Book of Mormon or praying to know if it was true. Indeed, many non-Mormons have experienced this burning in the bosom. But we must be careful not to confuse the Lord's touching our soul with a simple heartwarming feeling related to an emotional response or passionate elation. The event or drama which generates this response need not be true. It may come from watching a tearjerker movie where the protagonist dies saving his friend, or listening to a rousing rendition of the national anthem or the battle hymn of the Republic, or even reading one of Paul Dunn's war stories. President, I hope that you take this in the spirit it's given. I've been direct, even blunt, but you strike me as a man who would prefer candor to approbation. I'm an old man, and if I'm wrong to ask why, I'll know soon enough, as will you. As it happens, and quite unintentionally, I'm writing this letter to you on Father's Day, 2017. My father, Thomas Douglas, was a thoughtful and honorable man. He taught me in his humble way that truth is essential. It endures forever, and we should be dauntless in seeking to find it. The Lord, too, admonished us to pursue the truth, for the truth will set you free. I cannot dishonor my father's memory by placing all these weighty problems back on my drooping shelf and then just walk away. You'll remember that Christ told Pilate before his agonizing death, "For this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth." The LDS Church has shown that it can change.
So I would say to anyone listening to this that chooses to remain in the Mormon Church, particularly my LGBTQ brothers and sisters, fresh courage take. For when the pressure is on, the brethren receive revelation. I believe that fairly soon women will finally be invited to play a meaningful leadership role in the church, that an accommodation will be made for same-sex unions in some manner, that practicing gay men and women will find a home in the church, and the ill-conceived policy of banning the children of gay couples from church membership will be reversed. The latter has happened since I wrote this initially in 2017. Why? Because the principal goal of every bureaucracy is survival, and the corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is certainly no exception. None of these changes will make the Mormon Church any more or less true. However, it'll advance the Church's obvious desire to be viewed as a mainstream Christian religion, and will reduce the hurt and harm some of its current policies cause. I'm writing to you asking these difficult questions, not solely for myself, an insignificant sinner, but for the myriad credulous men and women who put their unwavering faith in you and your colleagues. Particularly, I write to you on behalf of the generation of innocent little children who deserve to grow up knowing what is true. So, President Uchtdorf, let me make one final plea to you, to help those of us honestly searching for answers. Faithful Latter-day Saints believe that there's no higher authority on earth than you and your colleagues. Indeed, you and they would have us believe that you speak to and on behalf of the Almighty. You know, I know, and more members are coming to know that there are not just disquieting questions, but serious problems with the truth claims of the Mormon Church, the Book of Mormon, and the Joseph Smith story. Is it not time that you and your brethren provide direct, honest, and full-throated responses to the questions I raise in the interrogatories that follow, to do what is right, letting the consequence follow? If not now, when? If not you, then who?
Well, this concludes this episode of A Letter to an Apostle. Please tune in next time when we can continue our journey together. Until then, this is Paul Douglas wishing you all the very best.